This is Audible.
Recorded Books and One Click Digital present The Beautiful Daughters by Nicole Baart, narrated by Meredith Orlo. For all the beautiful daughters, you know who you are. Hope has two daughters. Their names are Anger and Courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are. St. Augustine of Hippo. Part 1. Adrian. It was less a car accident than a struck match. Adrian had felt off all day, lopsided and a little dizzy, like the time she had taken the cable car to the top of Gibraltar and nearly fallen off the rock from vertigo. But she had ignored the strange sense of premonition, the feeling that her world was about to change, because Adri didn't like change. And she didn't like the madness exploding around her, each scene a snapshot so smudged and surreal she had to wonder if it was all a bad dream, a nightmare. But it wasn't. Broken glass. The thick scent of gasoline whipped up by the wind. Two dark slashes on the concrete that marked the place where the truck driver had hit the brakes too late. The road was a menacing swath of sharp edges, and the crowd a riot of colors and fists and dialects Adri didn't understand. She could taste the musky press of hot skin, the sour-sweet tang of the red dust that churned beneath her feet. It was familiar and foreign, home and away. She wasn't afraid until someone reached into the wreckage of the overturned truck and brandished a single bottle that hadn't been shattered in the rollover. It was an empty Fanta bottle, utterly harmless, until he smashed it against the upturned bumper and held it, jagged and glittering like a blade. The man wasn't even looking at her. His fist was raised high above his head, where the bottle caught the sun and refracted light like fine crystal. But Adri knew that pretty things could be deadly. And whether or not she was a part of the drama that smoldered around her, she had to get off the street. She had to get Caleb off the street. Adri put her hand out for him, but she clutched at air. Spinning around, she scanned the crowd and caught sight of him in the ditch below the compound. "They're shutting the gate," Caleb called. He looked back at Adri, frozen amid the African kristallnacht that roiled around her, and shouted something that she couldn't hear over the sudden rush and roar of the growing mob. She ran, and thanked the Lord and her father and the North Face for the grace of sturdy boots as glass crunched beneath her feet. Adri had swapped her sandals for boots at the last minute because it was an immunization day and the children had learned quickly what the needles meant. Sometimes she had to pin them down. She had to scuffle and wrestle and fight, and though it was easily 100 degrees in the shade, she wore cargo pants, a long-sleeved white shirt, the boots. The heavy metal gate that guarded the entrance to the compound had been swung into place, but Caleb was already halfway through the pedestrian door. He held it open for Adri, scanning the crowd behind her to see if anyone would try to follow, and when she was close enough to touch, he grabbed her by the elbow and yanked her through, slammed the gate shut with an iron clang. Tamba, the security guard, laughed. "It's an election day," he said, offering his hands palm up as if he was gifting them with an easy answer to the madness. "We are a passionate people." His easy smile dispelled the thin fog of her fear, and Adri's cheeks warmed in embarrassment. West Africa had been her home, her place of chosen exile, for nearly 5 years, and Adri liked to consider herself a local. But every once in a while, an unexpected encounter reminded her that she was not. She'd run like a child, like a foreigner. It was humiliating. Even worse, Adri suddenly realized that Caleb was still gripping her arm. His shoulders curled around her protectively as if he intended to shield her from the chaos unfolding behind them. She was tiny inside his arms, so small she felt like she could turn her face into his chest and disappear. It was a dangerous feeling, the sort of longing she couldn't let herself give into. Adri went rigid at the warmth of his breath on her neck, and willed herself to remember who he was, who she was. even though she tingled in the places where he touched her. "It's okay," she murmured, forcing herself to pull away. Caleb's hand tightened for just a moment before he let go. Taking a deliberate step back, Adri tucked an errant strand of hair behind her ear and tightened her ponytail with a tug. She gave the earnest young security guard a wry smile. "A passionate people. I should know that by now, right?" "You are a wise woman, Miss Voigt." Tomba's eyes sparked like lit coal in the sunlight. "People will get hurt, but it is not," he trailed off, searching, "intended." "Malicious?" Adri offered. "It means they don't mean to do any harm." "Yes," Tomba grinned. "It is not malicious." "Looks malicious to me." Caleb stood well away from the gate and surveyed the swarm with a critical eye. It was a sight to behold. The streets were full of people, and though most of the political parties had advocated for a peaceful election, the air had shimmered with a live charge for days. When the truck that collected empty bottles from the hundreds of roadside stands had crested a hill and found a small knot of people deep in conversation in the middle of his lane, he couldn't stop in time. No one had been hit, and the driver had crawled out of his vehicle with nothing more than a scratch on his arm. Adri knew it wasn't serious. She had examined him herself, though he had only allowed her ministrations after someone recognized her and vouched for her credentials. Adri wasn't known by name. She was known by title. The nurse. It didn't matter that she wasn't their nurse, that she worked for a series of orphanages that spread throughout the capital city and beyond, instead of for the tiny local clinic. What mattered was the stethoscope she wore around her neck or tucked in an oversized pocket. The ability to diagnose crypto with a few questions and prescribed boiled water and rest. The nurse was a miracle worker, whether she believed in her own abilities or not. The noise and confusion of the accident were still drawing a crowd, and as far as Adri could see in either direction, the highway was completely gridlocked. There were people standing on top of cars, the sharp report of provocative presidential slogans, the sickening knowledge that things could go sideways, whirl out of control in a heartbeat. Sometimes they did. A slow-burning election battle exploded into violence. A humanitarian crisis ignited global outrage. But just as often, the flame of revolt burned fast and bright, leaving nothing behind but shards of broken glass on the pavement. "Stay safe," Adri said, dragging her attention away from the scene. She gave Tomba an abbreviated form of the traditional handshake. It was the way locals said hello, goodbye. It was second nature to her. "I will," he nodded, but it was obvious that he didn't think there was much to stay safe from. They were, as he said, a passionate people, loving and loyal and strong, forgiving, of themselves and each other. Adri had been the recipient of such small mercies more times than she could ever hope to count, and she knew better than to fear what she didn't understand. Although sometimes, amid shouts and confusion and sharp edges, it was hard to quiet the voice deep inside her that screamed, "Run." "He can't defend the gate alone," Caleb said at Adri's shoulder as they started down the hill toward the houses and the sea. "Who? Tomba?" Adri was only half listening. Her heart was slowing to a normal rhythm, but in the aftermath of panic, her backpack felt unbearably heavy. She was hot and exhausted and covered in a fine film of sticky dust. She longed for a swim. "They'll storm the compound." Not breaking stride, Adri glanced toward the gate and took measure of the throng of people beyond the thick bars. She shrugged, choosing to take her cue from Tomba's cool assessment. It was her job to stay calm, collected. She did it well. "It's more like a party than an uprising," she said. "I've seen worse. It'll fizzle out soon enough." "Come on, Adri. Don't act all tough. You were scared back there." Adri regretted her earlier lapse of self-control. Weighing her words carefully, she said, "It looks worse than it is. We don't understand the history and emotions that contribute to a day like this. Elections are a big deal. Caleb just stared at her, his steps quick and sure on the uneven road, even as he questioned her judgment. Adri couldn't quite read him. He wasn't scared, but there was something simmering just beneath the surface. We probably should have stayed in the compound, Adri admitted. It was almost an apology. But no harm done. No harm done, Caleb repeated quietly, his expression blank. What? It's like 5 o'clock, and this is the first indication of disorder we've seen. She tipped her chin as if daring him to disagree. It was a perfectly normal day until 10 minutes ago. Normal? Disorder? He thrust an arm backward and pointed to the melee they had left behind. You call that disorder? Adri stopped abruptly and faced him. Passing the back of her hand across her forehead, she reminded herself that Caleb was new. And an almost riot in a country fresh from civil war was enough to make her heart skip a beat too. Caleb had been in West Africa for less than 12 weeks, and the bright-eyed ideology he had carried with him like an oversized suitcase was still being dismantled bit by frustrating bit. She tried to remember her first few months, the spiders and the fire ants, the bites that swelled to the size of small tumors. Malaria medication made her sick and gave her night terrors that transformed her into an insomniac. The food turned her stomach to water. Adri didn't mean to, but she thought about the exact moment that baby had died in her arms, the fraction of a second when the feather-light brush of his tiny limbs became dead weight, and he was so simply, so irrevocably gone. She swallowed hard. I'm sorry, she said. We shouldn't have left the compound today. My mistake. I wanted to administer the second round of the Hep B vaccines on schedule. Caleb softened a little, and Adri was startled by the dark intensity of his gaze as he studied her. He had flirted with her before, suggesting with the slightest graze of his fingertip that they could be more than co-workers, with a look that could be interpreted 100 different ways. He was tempting. More than that, there was something about him that was undeniably different, compelling. But Adri worked hard to be aloof with him, with everyone. It was just one of the many ways that she hid in plain sight. Apology accepted, Caleb said. But just so I know, what are we going to do if... He let the question dangle, and a dozen terrifying possibilities spilled from the hint of his suggestion. There are contingency plans. Adri started walking again. Our night security guard is coming early. Caleb narrowed his eyes. He's not a security guard, he's a kid. Samaritan's Purse has a helicopter. And the UN has Blackhawks, Caleb said abruptly. He seemed to be comforted by the thought. They know where we are. Adri laughed. They have bigger fish to fry. Caleb didn't respond. At the bottom of a long hill, they entered the compound proper. The dirt road branched off in 3 different directions, and squat, block houses cropped up among the cotton trees and oil palms. Scarlet rhododendrons flanked small porches clustered with sagging lawn chairs, and here and there, residents tried to urbanize the jungle with random attempts at domesticity in the form of potted plants. It struck Adri as downright ridiculous. Wasn't the native flora enough? After 5 years of living at the very edge of the known world, she still couldn't get over the fact that she could step out of her front door and pluck sweet, ripe plantains off the tree in her yard. The compound was a haven in the heart of the capital city, a sprawling village where various NGOs and missionary families had congregated after the Civil War ended and it was officially declared safe to return. Adri had never known war. She stepped foot on African soil after the last of the rebels were driven from the bush. To her, the collection of homes, guest houses, and small office buildings that populated the compound were simply neighborhood and community, and the melange of humanitarian workers and expats were family, more or less. Adri had found that although many of the volunteers and aid workers in her little corner of Africa were sincere and altruistic in their motives, just as many were running away from something, or someone. She could relate. They didn't pry, and neither did she. Adri's house was a 2-bedroom bungalow with a tiny eat-in kitchen and a bathroom that was perpetually grimy, no matter how much she cleaned it. All inadequacies aside, Adri adored every inch of the 600 square feet of her home. She had bunked with other coworkers, board members passing through, friends of friends. It was how things were done when space was at a premium and nothing quite worked out the way you hoped it would. A bigger house was in the works, but funding had dried up, and for better or worse, Adri's place was forced into service as home base. Once, when she was hosting the founder, his wife, and teenage son for a single night, Adri had slept in her bathtub, a late 19th century claw-footed monstrosity that had amazingly found its way to the west coast of Africa. But living with Caleb had come with a brand new set of discomforts. The air was alive, charged. He had earned his nursing degree after backpacking through Asia and deciding that life was too short to not make a difference. That's how he introduced himself to her in their first email exchange. I want to make a difference. So did Adri, but his admission looked especially ingenuous in type. She liked him more than she wanted to, and bristled at the way he made her feel jaded. Are you going for a swim? Adri asked, fitting her key into the front door. Her back was to the ocean, and although the water was across the road and down a wide orange beach, she could imagine that the spray licked the back of her neck, her bare arms. Tonight? Caleb sounded surprised. The fence doesn't go down the beach, Adri. They could hear the beat of drums in the distance now, the swell and whoop of voices shouting for something they couldn't make out and wouldn't understand even if they could. You think we're safer in the house? They're cement block walls. A hammer would take them down. You said we were safe. We are, but I'm messing with you, Adri said. She wrenched open the door and held it for him. Caleb was a year or two older than her 26 years, knocking on the door of 30, but she couldn't help feeling like the more experienced one. She interpreted his optimism as naivete and sometimes doubted the wisdom of the board of the nonprofit she worked for in appointing him her second-in-command. He was confident, enthusiastic, gorgeous. He was wreaking havoc in her carefully ordered world. And yet, Adri knew that pickings had to have been slim. Not many people wanted to live halfway around the world in an unstable country for a little more than room, board, and the unfamiliar, often slightly rancid food they ate. Adri hadn't known what she was getting herself into when she signed the contract fresh from college. She just wanted to get away. And Africa was as far away as she could imagine. The plan was to run and keep running. Staying hadn't really been an option. But the kids at the orphanages she served turned out to be a pure addiction. Adri loved them simply, fiercely. They made Africa home. Can I say something off the record? Caleb said. He didn't move to step into the house, but stood in the grass just off the cement slab that served as a front step. He blurted, Sometimes I hate it here. She didn't know what to say. He had been her faithful sidekick for weeks. His enthusiasm a veneer that seemed impenetrably thick, slathered on with a heavy hand. Caleb had never once given her the impression that life in Africa struck him as anything other than a grand adventure. But here was something real. The riot had scratched the surface. Beneath was the flush of sincerity, something as heady and masculine as the scent of his skin before a swim. It tested the safe borders of their roommate-coworker relationship. The intimacy of it made Adri white-knuckle the edge of the door. Caleb ran his hands over his head, his eyes widening at the prickle of the buzz cut Adri had given him only a couple of days before. His hair had been camel-colored and just a little curly, but when he finally begged her to get rid of it for him, the cut had revealed dark roots that accented his jawline and sun-bright blue eyes. He was beautiful, in a rugged, unexpected way, and that only made him more likable. Adri didn't want to like him. I don't mean that, Caleb said, dropping his hands to his sides. I don't hate it here. Yes, you do. At least a little. She almost said, we all do. But that was a terrible lie, and also the truth. Adri let the door fall shut behind her and tossed her pack onto the grass. I shouldn't have teased you. We shouldn't have gone out today, and I shouldn't have teased you. Caleb looked up at the doorframe of the house, the tile roof and the crumbling breezeway blocks of the two front windows. His jaw hardened almost imperceptibly. What if I want to go back? He certainly wouldn't be the first. Why? Maybe I can't cut it here. The schedule, the mosquitoes, the sickness, the poverty, the kids, they break my heart, Adri. What are we doing? We're not their parents, but that's what they need. I feel like I'm drowning sometimes. It's too much. We can't help everyone, and I wonder if we're helping anyone at all. It was true. Everything he said was true, but it felt like an attack all the same. She bristled, wanting to fight. But just as quickly as her anger had flared, it fizzled out and died. Fine, Adri sighed. Whatever. I'm sure the board will want to hear from you before you make any travel arrangements, but this is hardly a prison. You're free to go. She indicated the door with an outstretched hand, inviting him to go inside and pack, to pretend that his third world hiatus was nothing more than an ink blot on the predictable map of his life. He was embarrassed when he swept past. His head was down and he wouldn't look at her. But just over the threshold, Caleb stopped and turned back. Stared her straight in the eye, boldly and without an ounce of guile. You don't have to stay here either, you know. You're not a prisoner. The sun was beating against Adri's auburn hair and sending little rivulets of sweat down the side of her face. But his words were a slap of ice water, cold and so startling that for a moment she couldn't breathe. He must have sensed that he'd struck a nerve. You could go home, Adrian. You could come with me. Caleb's eyes betrayed him. She had assumed that he was after nothing more than a tropical fling, a no-strings-attached affair that he'd casually forget the moment he decided to shoulder his backpack and abandon her little corner of Africa in search of the next big thrill. She figured his tattoos lacked meaning, and that his Médecins Sans Frontières poster boy persona were affectations. But standing across from him in the slanting light, Adri could almost believe that his offer was something more. Maybe he was something more. You could come with me. As if she could just leave it all behind and start over. As if she could be the girl she had been all those years ago, those years before she crossed an ocean and became a person that she didn't recognize when she looked in the mirror. As if he could offer her the sort of new beginning that she had stopped dreaming about long ago. As if. If there was anything Adri knew, it was that some things could not be undone. Go pack your stuff, Adri said, turning away toward the ocean and the sunburned sand and the dark sliver of an impossibly thin fishing boat beyond the breakers. I'm never going back. And inside a zippered pocket of her cargo pants, her cell phone began to ring. Chapter 2. Adri swung her pack into the back of the Land Rover and slammed the hatch. You're not taking much, Caleb said, putting his hand out for the keys. It had been a point of contention who would drive to the airport, but in the end, Adri reluctantly conceded that if Caleb was going to stick around, he better learn to navigate the streets, if they could be called that. She handed him the keychain with what she hoped was a reproachful smile, but her face felt frozen, numb. She felt numb, and had from the moment she answered the phone and heard her father's voice. She's gone, Adri. I'm sorry, baby, but you need to come home. Adri didn't fight with her father. She never had. It was pointless to shout at a man who would never raise his voice back. But she had argued for almost an hour, begging him to take care of it for her, to somehow fix things so she wouldn't have to leave Africa. In the end, there was nothing for it. And if Adri was really honest with herself, there was a certain poetic justice in going back. She deserved it. Adri felt her heart squeeze to a pinprick. She tried to swallow and make herself focus on Caleb, his comment. I don't need to take much, she said. I won't be gone long. Caleb cocked an eyebrow and disappeared around the side of the Land Rover. You said you wouldn't be gone at all. He called over the top of the dusty vehicle. In fact, if I recall correctly, you said, and I quote, "I'm never going back." Adri wrenched open the door and swung herself inside. And you said you hated it here. You said you were leaving. Yeah, well, things change. And you called it. It was a party, not an uprising. He shrugged off the conversation with a casual lift of his shoulder. Adri didn't want to let him off the hook that easily, but life here was nothing if not a flash of silver. The shuffle of the everyday was slow, almost tedious, and yet, in less than a second, the entire world could tip and change. A clear blue sky tore open along a hidden seam and spilled a storm so furious it ripped leaves from trees. A child who had previously refused even to look at Adri tucked himself beneath her arm and fell instantly and peacefully asleep, with his cheek pressed tight against her chest. Adri understood the swift flip of emotion, the way it was possible to be tossed like a coin and land unexpectedly face down. Caleb had watched her eyes, the way her knees buckled at her father's proclamation, and he had fallen exactly where he needed to be. He hadn't gone into the bungalow to pack his things. Instead, he made her a cup of tea and called the airline to search for a flight for Miss Adrienne Claire Voigt. She couldn't help but admire him for it. Watching him settle into the bucket seat, Adri wondered for a moment if she should say something, maybe thank you, but Caleb had already turned his attention to other things. He clicked his seatbelt on and started the Land Rover with entirely too much relish. His throaty chuckle matched the growl of the SUV as he revved the engine. You do know how to drive a Standard, right? Adri grabbed the gear shift as if to stop him from driving out of the compound, but Caleb seized the opportunity and covered her small hand with his own. I think I remember, he smirked. But I suppose we could shift together. Adri tried to wrench her hand away, but Caleb held on. Hey, take a deep breath. He ducked his head a little so that he could catch her eye. Giving her a sympathetic smile, he said, Everything is going to be okay. Adri snorted. Here or there? Both. I've got things covered here, and you'll take care of everything at home. This is home. This is where you came when you ran away from home. Caleb searched her face for a moment, but he didn't seem to find what he was looking for. He lifted his hand and Adri snatched her arm away. Weaving her fingers together in her lap, she forced herself to look out the passenger window at her bungalow, the turquoise sea beyond. Her throat tightened at the sudden, shocking reality of leaving this place, of going back to her provincial hometown in rural Iowa, and all the memories, all the people she had tried hard to leave behind. She didn't belong there anymore, and just the thought of going back was enough to make her break out in a cold sweat. She hadn't been home in over 3 years. She hadn't seen her father, or Victoria. And now it was too late to say the things she'd always hoped to say. But she couldn't face all that just yet. Instead, as Caleb eased the Land Rover into reverse, she focused on the details. The way the sunlight waltzed with the leaves, a handsome little gecko on the side of her house, the plantains that hung heavy on the tree in her front yard. They would be ripe in a matter of days. She wondered if Caleb would remember to bring them to the cooks at the orphanage, or if they would rot on the branch and slip off the tree to molder on the ground. Don't forget the bananas. I've got this, Adri. They're plantains, she muttered. For the foo-foo, I know. Caleb waved to Tamba and took a left out of the gate onto the only decent road in the entire country. It was relatively smooth black asphalt, an aberration in a city where the rest of the streets were unmapped and nearly impassable. The rainy season washed away gravel and left behind jagged rocks and deep craters where garbage and water collected in a septic soup diabolically perfect for mosquitoes. It was the beginning of September, almost the end of the rainy season, but there were still several difficult weeks ahead. Adri glanced at Caleb out of the corner of her eye and hoped that he, and the Land Rover, would survive her absence. She couldn't stop herself. The mosquito nets, I'll check them, and I'll make sure Joseph gets his sickle cell meds, and I won't forget the community cook stove project meeting tomorrow afternoon. Caleb bumped Adrie's elbow with his own. It was a consoling gesture, a reassurance of his dependability. I promise to hug them every time I leave, extra squeezes for Hannah and Lucia. Because they still cry every night. She held herself rigid, willing the tears to evaporate before she had to wipe them and broadcast her weakness. Caleb dutifully kept his eyes on the road before them. He wasn't far to the airport, less than an hour's drive if there were no goats on the highway, but the route was clogged with history that made Adrie catch her breath no matter how ordinary the landmarks became. There was the shell of a single ancient tank, vines twisting through the wreckage as if trying to hide the grisly reality of past violence. Here was the corner where a warlord had hid his troops in the jungle and ambushed unsuspecting travelers. There were bombed-out cars in the undergrowth and surely bones in the dirt. Who could forget? And yet there was a grace in the lavender snowfall of jacaranda blooms beneath a lone willowy tree. Pardon in the way a child brushed a petal from his head and sipped water from a plastic bag in the shade of his mother's roadside stand. Adrie gulped it all in, greedy, wanting. It was wild here, but safe. So different from home, where everything that seemed tame had fangs. She didn't hate Black Hawk or the people there. She never had. But she could never quite seem to live gracefully beneath the weight of expectation. Adrie had crumbled. Caleb was driving too fast. There wasn't enough traffic. She'd be gone in a heartbeat, and that terrified her even more than all that waited at home. "Will you make it for the funeral?" Caleb asked after a while. Adrie felt a jolt of annoyance, but he didn't seem to be fishing for lurid details. No. It was one whispered word, but it sounded like a guilty admission to Adrie's ears. She cleared her throat. "No. Victoria wanted to be buried straight away. There will be a memorial next week." "Do you have to arrange that?" Her head whipped around. "I hope not." "What exactly are you supposed to do?" "I don't know. I've never been the executor of a will before." Caleb tried to give her a reassuring look. "Whatever you have to do, you'll do it right." "And you know this how?" Adrie was too preoccupied to worry if she sounded snappy. But Caleb didn't seem to mind the sharp edge in her voice. "I've never seen you give anything less than 110%, he said. "You're more than a perfectionist, Adrie." "What's that supposed to mean?" He thought for a moment, his lips pressed in a tight line. "You're a purist," he finally concluded. "The journey matters to you as much as the end result." Adrie was rattled, but she hoped Caleb didn't realize how much he had unnerved her. He was right. She could hardly brush her teeth without considering the consequences. When every action sent a ripple she couldn't control out into a world she barely understood, it was impossible not to believe that her choices mattered. Adrie swallowed. "What makes you think you know me?" "You wear your heart on your sleeve," Caleb said simply. "You think you're big and tough and untouchable, but you're not." Adrie tried to laugh, but only managed a strangled, choking sound. "I guess you have me pegged, don't you?" "I didn't mean it in a bad way." Caleb flicked his blinker on and turned down the winding road to the only airport in the country. 2 sniper towers stood sentry on either side of the intersection, and long rolls of barbed wire unfurled above miles of chain-link fencing. "It's just that I've seen you with the kids, Adrie. I know how much you love them and how much you're willing to sacrifice for them. I can only assume you'll extend the same care and consideration to settling your friend's estate." Adrie didn't know what to say, so she didn't say anything at all. The airport parking lot was makeshift at best, and she was grateful when Caleb was forced to drop the disconcerting thread of their one-sided conversation and focus on finding an empty space. There were people everywhere, touching the SUV, rapping the glass with their knuckles, and motioning that Caleb should roll down his window and listen to whatever sales pitch they had rehearsed. He ignored them all. Was she a good friend? Caleb finally broke the silence as he eased into an alarmingly narrow space in the midst of a swarming crowd. He tapped a teenage boy with his bumper in the process. The kid threw up his arms and shouted something vile at the Land Rover, but by some small miracle he kept walking. Caleb was unfazed, and Adri added an imaginary checkmark to the running list of her coworkers' attributes. Victoria, I mean. Were you too close? Mrs. Galloway was supposed to be my mother-in-law. Adri felt a stab of satisfaction when Caleb was stunned into silence. She didn't say anything more, didn't offer any resolution to the story that hung untold between them. His curiosity was almost palpable, but she unclicked her seatbelt and was out of the vehicle before he had turned off the engine. In some act of unnecessary loyalty, or maybe misplaced chivalry, Caleb kept Adri company for more than 2 hours as she waited for entrance into the airport proper. She admired his devotion, even if she wished for the reprieve of solitude. But she reminded herself that the transatlantic trip was well over 30 hours. She'd have plenty of time to steel herself for the culture shock of stepping foot in tiny Black Hawk, Iowa. When the metal gates before the single check-in counter were finally swung open, Caleb was obliged to stand on the other side of a rope barrier. But though the security guards kept shooting him dark looks, he stayed shoulder to shoulder with Adri, waiting for the moment when she would cross through the crowd and the door and be gone. "I've never been to Disney World," Caleb said out of the blue. "I grew up in Florida, and I've never been to Disney World." "What?" Adri shot him a funny look, convinced the heat had finally fried his brain. "It's a game." He smiled. "I've decided I don't know you as well as I think I do." "Shocking," she interrupted. "And I'd like to change that." Adri did a rough count. "There are less than 20 people ahead of me. I'll be gone in a minute. How much do you think you can learn?" "Enough," Caleb said. "I've never been to Disney World. Now, tell me something about you that I don't know." Victoria Galloway was supposed to be my mother-in-law. I already know that. Caleb suddenly sounded serious. Adri sighed, but she didn't have the energy to argue. Besides, she couldn't help feeling she owed Caleb something. He was staying. He was taking over her job, and even if she came back in a couple of days and he decided to leave, she could never thank him enough for filling in when he was desperately needed. She flipped through a mental file and came up with something more or less innocuous. "I used to barrel race." "Barrel race? As in horses, like in the rodeo?" She nodded. "In high school, I had a friend whose dad was a bull rider. One summer we trained on her horse and signed up to barrel ride during the county fair." "How'd you do?" Adri shrugged. "There were only 3 of us. I got 2nd place." "Okay." Caleb rubbed his chin as he digested this tidbit of information. "My dad designed all of my tattoos. He's an artist." "Wow." Adri considered the colorful landscape of his arms with new appreciation. There was a ship and a storm cloud so real and cast in hue that she could almost smell the rain. An exquisite bird. A word in a language she didn't recognize. Stretching out a single finger, Adri almost touched the shaft of a sharp-tipped arrow that ran the length of his forearm. When she realized what she was doing, she balled her hand into a fist and crammed it in her pocket. "He's very talented." "Thanks. Your turn." She had to think for a moment. "I grew up on a farm." "I grew up in the city." "I have a twin brother." Caleb's eyes widened. "Fraternal or identical?" "Identical twins can't be a different gender," Adri laughed. "I mean, does he look like you?" "We're more like polar opposites." "Cool," Caleb said with a smile. "I'd like to meet him." The line was dwindling. and the security guards seemed to be increasingly uncomfortable with the tattooed white man who refused to leave Adrie's side. "You'd better go," she said, nodding at two armed guards who were talking furiously and motioning to Caleb. "One more thing," he said. "Tell me one more thing about you, and I'll walk away, I promise." "I'll be back in a week, Caleb. We can continue your ridiculous trivia then." But he wouldn't give up. "Humor me." Adrie rolled her eyes. Caleb was playing a dangerous game, one that toyed with the stabilizing anchor that Adrie had dropped in the sea on the day she first arrived in this country, that was so far from everything she had ever known. She didn't want to be moved. She didn't want anything at all to change, because she felt, if not exactly safe here, at least grounded. The borders of her world were solid and comforting. Caleb was wrong. She was a prisoner, but she was exactly where she wanted to be. It was time to shatter any romantic notions Caleb insisted on harboring. As much as he liked to think that he knew her, he didn't understand the first thing about Adrienne Voigt. Taking a step toward him, Adrie broke all her own rules and laid a hand on his chest. Caleb was taller by a few inches, and she had to stand on her tiptoes to reach his face. He stiffened when she leaned into him, but when her lips grazed past his cheek and lingered against his ear, Adrie could feel the tremor that vibrated beneath his warm skin. "I killed a man," Adrie whispered. Caleb went perfectly still, and his heart beat a single hard thump that Adrie could feel in his neck. She hadn't prepared herself for the wave of disappointment that engulfed her, the unexpected sorrow of understanding that she had done it. She had effectively and permanently succeeded in pushing him away. It broke her heart a little, but grief for what might have been was a luxury she didn't have time for. Adrie swallowed it down like a bitter but necessary pill. "There you go," she murmured in his ear. "That's all you need to know." Adrie pushed away and took a few steps forward to keep pace with the steadily moving line. Straightening the strap of her backpack where it had slipped off her shoulder, she took a shaky breath and told herself that she had done the right thing. Caleb had to go. She refused to look back at him, but she could imagine his dazed stare, the hurried scrape of his feet as he all but ran from her. By the time she got back from the States, his bags would be packed, and Caleb would be ready to join the ranks of all the memories she kept secreting in corners of her soul. At least she hoped so. But before she could mentally rearrange the soon-to-be spare bedroom in her little home, someone caught her by the arm and spun her around. Caleb kissed her once, a sweet but firm weight on her slightly open mouth. Then he put his lips against her ear and whispered, "Then I guess I'm falling for a murderess." He winked as he walked away, and the gentleman behind Adrie in line had to give her a shove to keep her moving. When they took her pack from her and rooted through it, she barely registered the brash invasion of her privacy, and she didn't even blink when a female guard patted her down. Within minutes, she was sequestered in a cramped waiting room, surrounded by strangers who looked like they longed to be anywhere but where they found themselves, caged like cattle awaiting transport. Adrie made her way to the farthest wall and a bay of windows that pointed in the direction of the parking lot. She couldn't see the Land Rover, the angle was wrong, and even if she could find the spot where Caleb had parked hours ago, she doubted that he'd still be there. He had disappeared with a wink and a grin, and Adrie was left with nothing more than the lingering impression of his kiss and the harsh understanding that her plan had backfired. Caleb thought she was lying. Chapter 3. Adrie had nothing but time. 42 hours, to be exact, as her last-minute ticket out of Africa routed her through Brussels to New York, where she had to switch from Newark to JFK and endure an overnight layover. She spent the slow hours of the intercontinental flight wishing for sleep, as she flipped through stations on the in-flight TV. The movies and sitcoms were supposed to be a distraction, a way to erase the memory of Caleb, his kiss. But by the time she touched down on American soil, Adri was numb with exhaustion and convinced she could still feel the warmth of Caleb's hand on her arm. He seemed to draw her to her feet as everyone around her began to disembark, to prod her forward with an encouraging squeeze. Somehow, Adri made it through customs and immigration and found her way to the bus stop, where she boarded the Newark Airport Express and prayed she was headed in the right direction. As the shuttle bus wove through New Jersey, Adri closed her eyes against the crush of traffic and fought to keep down the pretzels she had nibbled on the plane. She was accustomed to the chaos of third-world congestion, not the efficient, breakneck hum of taxis, buses, and commuter cars in one of the world's largest and most modern cities. When the bus pulled into New York's Port Authority bus terminal, it became a hub of quiet activity. Travelers grabbed their carry-ons and moved toward the door single file, some pressing bills into the driver's hand before they hurried down the steps and disappeared. Adri blinked around, surprised by the order, the unfamiliar scent of expensive cologne as it mingled with a perfume, maybe a lotion, that reminded her of blackberries and cream. She'd forgotten what blackberries tasted like, and it made her unaccountably sad. People stood a respectful distance from each other, careful not to touch. It was so polite, and somehow cold. "Are you getting off?" Adri looked up to see a young woman poised at her elbow. She had left a little room between her and the businessman in front of her, and with an outstretched hand was offering Adri a space in the line for the door. "No," Adri stammered, a little confused. "I'm getting off at JFK." The girl flicked blonde hair over her shoulder and smiled ruefully. "Actually, you have to switch buses to get to JFK. You need the NYC Airport or Express. It leaves every 15 minutes. "Oh." Adri fumbled for her backpack. "Are you sure? You came from Brussels, right?" The girl tipped her head toward Adri with a confident arch in her eyebrow. "I think we were on the same plane. I sat a few rows behind you. Anyway, I have to switch airports too. I'm headed to JFK. Adri yanked her pack off the floor and shuffled awkwardly past the empty aisle seat to take her place in line. "Thank you," she said. "I probably would have circled New York on the bus all night." "No prob. It's kind of confusing." The terminal was alive with people. A light breeze swirled up by all the motion sent a shiver down Adri's spine, and she wrapped her arms against her chest to ward off the chill. She hadn't been out of West Africa in 3 years, and the sudden rush of the world she had left behind was almost more than she could bear. It was dizzying and inexplicably heartbreaking. "It's this way," the girl from the bus called over the noise of the engines and the intercom and the crowd. She set off through the swarm of people, and Adri followed a step behind, anxious not to lose sight of the one person in a sea of strangers who had shared a smile with her. But it was more than that, and Adri knew it. This girl, this complete stranger, was a reminder. She was a stride or two in front of Adri, just out of reach, and in those few wordless moments everyone and everything else faded away. Adri was aware of nothing but the swing of the girl's caramel blonde hair and the way she threw her shoulders back, parting the crowd with a self-assured sway that was so familiar Adri felt her eyes burn suddenly hot. Adri had run away from a lot of things when she boarded that very first plane bound for Africa. Her hometown, her memories, the ghost of David Galloway. But in the end, it didn't matter what had happened or how everything had imploded. When the dust settled over the wreckage of her life, she knew she couldn't stay. She couldn't stay because when everything was said and done, Adri still loved Harper. But she hated her too. Harper Penny was a liar, a storyteller and a dreamer. She was an artist whose medium was the everyday, the people around her, the world. Harper painted it the way she wanted it to be, and reinvented herself to match the landscape. Cropped shirts to tease, stilettos when she wanted to rule. Even sweatpants could be wielded as a weapon. But Harper was practically naked the first time Adri laid eyes on the woman who would become her best friend. It was the last Saturday in August, the air so thick it was a tangible thing. Adri kept brushing her wrist against her forehead, trying to smooth the sticky breath of summer away, though she only succeeded in further tangling the damp strands of her shaggy dark bangs. Her arms were full of clothes on hangers, her entire wardrobe transferred from the passenger seat of her dad's truck up the 2 flights of stairs in the freshman dorm of Anderson Thomas University to her room halfway down the hallway. No air conditioning. Thankfully, the building wasn't yet packed with new students. The official move-in date was 2 days off, but local students and athletes were encouraged to come earlier. Adri had decided at the last minute to live in the dorms instead of at home, even though Maple Acres was less than a 10-minute drive away. Now she was grateful that the first impression her peers would form of her wouldn't be a Polaroid of this moment. A drop of sweat slipped behind her ear and down her neck. She needed a shower. Her formerly clean clothes needed a washing machine, and her door had fallen shut. Locked. Adri melted against the closed door of room 212 and let her head tip back to smack the wood. I did the same thing, locked myself out. The voice came from across the hall, and Adri's skin prickled at the realization that she wasn't alone. She didn't bother to open her eyes to address who was talking. She couldn't. The door locks automatically. My keys are inside. Adri was embarrassed to admit it. Roommate? She's not coming until Monday. No worries. The sound of movement, and Adri looked up to see what was happening. A quick shuffle in the sunny dorm room across the hall, and a girl emerged, beer in one hand, ice pick in the other. Who took an ice pick to college? Here. She thrust the sweating bottle of Coors Light into the mountain of clothes that Adri still clutched to her chest. Adri was forced to trap it between her chin and a black cardigan that seemed almost obscene in the hazy heat of the second floor. The bottle was frosty, mostly empty. She must have slammed it. ATU claimed a dry campus, but the girl wasn't even trying to hide her alcohol. Thanks, Adri said, remembering her manners, as the girl bent at the waist to thrust the ice pick in the lock. She couldn't help staring. The stranger was wearing a pair of boy shorts, striped, and a gray tank top. Bare feet, bare arms, bare legs that were at least a mile long. She was so tall that Adri wondered if she could fit through the door without ducking. It's not yours, she laughed. Adri realized she was talking about the beer. A faint metallic click, and the girl swung the door open with a flourish. There you go. You can thank me later. Thank you, Adri said dumbly anyway. She shuffled past her as the girl held the door open. A hand snaked out and snatched the beer bottle, so Adri dropped the clothes in a heap on her unmade bed. I'm Adri, by the way. Harper. An awkward moment passed where Adri would have normally stretched out her arm to shake hands, but Harper stood there with a fist on her hip, the other wrapped around the dark bottle. One side of her pretty mouth was curled up in a half smile. Questioning? Playful? Adri couldn't tell. Harper was decidedly gorgeous and just as intimidating. Golden blonde hair swept in a French braid that twisted over her shoulder, and eyes the color of wet stones. Gray and green and blue and brown all at once. Adri wasn't sure what to do next. But then Harper threw the last swallow of her beer down and set the empty bottle on Adri's desk. You can't just leave your clothes there, she chided, and separating out a couple of hangers, moved to Adri's closet and began to arrange her wardrobe, by season and color. When Adri's brother Will and his best friend Jackson arrived carrying a ratty old recliner between them, Harper was sitting cross-legged on Adri's hardback desk chair, regaling Adri with stories. The closet was open behind her, the rainbow-colored contents so neat it looked like it had been staged for a photo shoot. But the guys didn't give it a second glance. Will almost dropped his side of the chair when he saw Harper. "Over there," Adri pointed, giving her twin a look like daggers. She didn't know yet if Harper was her first friend at college or just the girl across the hall, but she wasn't thrilled about the way her brother looked like he wanted to trace the line of her leg from ankle to thigh. "Who's your friend?" Jackson asked. Adri worried that Harper might be offended by his casual assumption that they were friends. She either didn't care or didn't notice. "Harper Penny," she said, unfolding herself to stand full height and thrusting an empty hand at Will. He was still settling the recliner, his fingers caught between the floor and the piece of furniture, and was forced to give her nothing more than a wistful look. She shrugged and sat back down. "You local?" Will asked after introductions, sans handshakes, had been made. It was a stupid question. Of course she wasn't local. Black Hawk was a small town. The population practically doubled when ATU was in session. If Harper were local, they would have known exactly who she was. But Will didn't seem to realize how inane his inquiry sounded. He perched on the arm of the recliner and looked for all the world like a puppy who would love nothing more than to curl up in Harper's lap. "Nah, I'm a soccer player." Harper raised a shoulder as if it was obvious. She certainly had the body for it. But Adri found out later that Harper wasn't on the soccer team, or even a recreational player. She'd left home early, sick of summer and sicker of her parents, and figured no one would bother her if she showed up and acted like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was right. "Where are you from?" Will asked, trying to be offhand and failing miserably. Adri exchanged a look with Jackson, but he seemed more amused than annoyed. "DC?" Harper pressed her cuticles back with a long, painted fingernail the color of green apples. "How'd you end up here?" "It was the farthest place from home I got an acceptance letter from." "That bad?" Will asked, the slant of his mouth sympathetic, as if he knew what it was like to be so sick of his dad he was willing to fly across the country with no backup plan. The truth was, Adri and Will had been raised on a small dairy farm. More than acreage than an actual farm, really, in a corner of the country where one couldn't claim the distinction of farmer unless he boasted a couple thousand acres and a combine worth $500,000. But Sam Voight didn't mind that he was a bit of a joke. He was a hippie, a gentle soul who sang to his chickens when he butchered them and taught his children to love little things. Snow peas in June, a warm bath, fresh baked bread with honey straight from the comb. Adrian and William grew up without television or Kraft macaroni and cheese, and knew a life so sweet and tranquil that the world beyond the borders of their little homestead, Maple Acres, seemed shrill and explosive. "They're philosophy professors," Harper said, making her parents' profession sound like a synonym for axe murderer. "They've crammed John Locke and his ilk down my throat from the moment I slipped from the womb." She laughed at herself or at them. Adri couldn't tell. John Locke? Adri didn't realize that she said the name out loud until Harper fixed her with those mossy eyes. "And you thought John Locke was just that bald guy on Lost." It was true. Adri had no idea who John Locke was until Harper explained, much later, the famous philosopher and the TV series character. But far more unnerving than her own utter naivete was the sudden shocking realization that a creature like Harper Penny could exist. She was fierce and bright and attractive in a decidedly handsome way, all angles and lines and broad shoulders that were both beautiful and somehow masculine. With the body of an athlete, the mind of a scholar, and the tongue of a politician, Harper was a force to be reckoned with, and a surprisingly new breed of femininity that Adri couldn't quite get her head around. Women were a bit novel to Adri. Her mother had died after a short battle with breast cancer when the twins were 4, and Adri had a single, precious memory of her. A memory that she couldn't even be sure was real, but that she buried like treasure all the same. She dug it up from time to time, this moment of such inconsequence, a woman's hands in her hair, plaiting the earth-colored waves so gently that Adrie's lids fell heavy and savored it. It made her eyes sting hot every time. Adrie didn't understand women. They were bright pieces of a dozen different puzzles. She tried to fit them together to make some sense of womanhood and the mother she had only briefly known, but it was no use. There was no pinning them down. But that didn't stop her from loving them in secret.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.